Alan Wilson Watts lived from 1915 to 1973. He was British by birth, but spent most of his adult life in California. He called himself a philosophical entertainer, and this self-description reveals something important about his method. He did not want followers or converts to any particular religious doctrine. His goal was to transmit direct insight, not accumulate believers. He wanted to show people something they could verify through their own experience. Watts produced over 25 books and hundreds of recorded lectures across 4 decades. His central project was translating Eastern philosophical traditions for Western audiences. He drew primarily from Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and the Vedanta tradition of Hinduism. But he did not simply transplant these systems into Western soil. He synthesized them with Western psychology, physics, semantics, and cybernetics to create something genuinely new. He asked a single fundamental question throughout his entire body of work. That question: what is the nature of the self that seems to exist inside your head? More specifically, is this self what it appears to be? Watts argued that our ordinary sense of being a separate individual is the source of unnecessary suffering. This suffering is unnecessary because the separate self is not fundamentally real. It is a social and linguistic construction, not an accurate representation of what we are. Understanding this is not merely an intellectual exercise. It has practical consequences for how we live, relate to others, and treat our environment. Watts matters today because his ideas anticipated several developments in contemporary neuroscience and psychology. Modern brain research increasingly supports what he asserted decades ago. The unified self that seems to be in charge of your experience is largely a narrative construction. Your brain generates a story of selfhood after the fact to organize experience. Watts arrived at this conclusion through philosophical analysis and contemplative practice. Neuroscientists later arrived at similar conclusions through brain imaging and clinical studies. His work also matters because ecological crises have made his insights urgent. Watts argued that environmental destruction stems from a mistaken sense of separateness from nature. If you experience yourself as fundamentally apart from the natural world, you treat it as a resource. You exploit it without recognizing that you are simultaneously destroying yourself. This is a direct consequence of how you define the boundaries of your identity. Part 1. The Ego Illusion. Watts built his entire philosophy on one central observation about human experience. Most people feel themselves to be a center of awareness located somewhere behind their eyes. This center seems to look out through the eyes as if through windows. It appears to control the body somewhat like a driver controls a vehicle. Watts called this the sensation of being an ego enclosed in a bag of skin. He considered this sensation a hallucination, and he meant this word literally. A hallucination is a perception that does not correspond to anything real. The separate ego feels absolutely real to most people. But Watts argued this feeling does not match what science reveals about our actual situation. It also does not match the experiential insights of serious contemplatives across all major traditions. Both Western science and Eastern philosophy, he claimed, point to the same conclusion. The boundary we draw between self and world is conventional, not natural. Consider how this sense of separateness actually forms in childhood. No infant is born with a clear sense of being a distinct individual. Babies cannot distinguish their bodies from their environment in any crisp way. The sense of individual identity develops gradually through social interaction and language acquisition. Adults tell children who they are. They assign names, roles, expectations and boundaries through thousands of daily interactions. The child absorbs these definitions and eventually identifies with them completely. Language plays a crucial role in constructing the ego. English and most European languages require a subject for every verb. You cannot describe an action without implying a separate actor performing it. We say the wind blows, as if there were a thing called wind separate from the blowing. We say I think as if there were an entity called I separate from the thinking. But where exactly is this I located? When you search for it directly in experience, you find only thoughts, sensations, and perceptions. You never find a thinker separate from the thoughts themselves. This is not a new observation. The Scottish philosopher David Hume made the same point in the 18th century. When he looked inward to examine himself, he found only a bundle of perceptions. He could never catch himself as something apart from his mental contents. Buddhism reached identical conclusions through contemplative investigation over 2,000 years ago. The doctrine of anatta, meaning no self, is foundational to Buddhist psychology. Watts synthesized these parallel discoveries from different traditions and historical periods. The ego is therefore not a thing, but a process. It is a pattern of activity, not a fixed entity that performs the activity. Think of a whirlpool in a stream. The whirlpool has a recognizable form and location. But you cannot remove it from the water and examine it separately. It exists only as a pattern of movement within the larger flow. Similarly, what we call the ego is a pattern of activity within the larger field of experience. It has no existence independent of that field. Modern neuroscience has provided substantial support for this view. Psychologist Bruce Hood at Bristol University argues the self is a narrative the brain constructs. It synthesizes complex interactions between biology and environment into a simplified story. This story provides a sense of continuity and agency that helps us navigate social life. But the story is a functional simplification, not an accurate description of what occurs in the brain. No single brain region houses the self. Instead, selfhood emerges from interactions between many distributed neural systems. The brain's default mode network is particularly relevant here. This network becomes active when we are not focused on external tasks. It engages in self-referential thinking, remembering the past and imagining the future. It constructs the internal narrative we experience as our personal identity. Research shows that when this network quiets, people report experiences of ego dissolution. They describe losing the ordinary sense of being a separate self, bounded by skin. These experiences occur during deep meditation and with certain psychedelic compounds. They suggest that ordinary selfhood depends on specific brain activity, not fundamental reality. Watts anticipated these findings through philosophical analysis rather than brain imaging. He noticed that the ego seems to exist primarily when we think about ourselves. In moments of complete absorption in an activity, the sense of a separate observer disappears. Athletes call this being in the zone. Musicians experience it when playing improvised jazz. Children display it naturally during unstructured play. The ego returns when we reflect on the experience afterward. This pattern suggests the ego is a mode of experiencing rather than the thing that experiences. Watts drew an important distinction between the social ego and the organism. The body and its activities are undeniably real. You breathe, digest, circulate blood, and perceive the environment continuously. These processes require no sense of personal identity to operate. Your heart beats without consulting your ego for permission. But the social ego, the image you have of yourself, is something else entirely. It is a collection of ideas about who you are based on social feedback. It is made of memories, concepts, and other people's opinions internalized over time. This social ego is what Watts called a genuine fake or an authentic illusion. It is genuine in the sense that everyone has one, and society depends on these constructions. Legal systems, economic relationships, and moral responsibility all presuppose individual selves. Society could not function without people playing their assigned roles. But it is fake in the sense that it does not accurately represent what you fundamentally are. You are not your social role, your name, your reputation, or your personal history. These are useful fictions like the Equator or the International Dateline. They serve practical purposes but have no existence independent of human agreement. The consequences of believing the ego to be absolutely real are severe, according to Watts. It creates a fundamental sense of isolation and loneliness. If you are a separate thing surrounded by an alien world, you are ultimately alone. Everything outside your skin becomes potentially threatening or useful, but never truly yourself. This perspective generates chronic anxiety about survival and status. It produces a desperate need to defend and aggrandize the ego against all perceived threats. Wars, exploitation, and environmental destruction follow from this basic misperception. We treat the world as something to conquer because we think we are separate from it. Watts was careful to clarify what he was not saying. He did not claim that individuality is worthless or that we should try to eliminate it. He was not advocating a kind of spiritual suicide where the person dissolves into undifferentiated mush. The point is subtler. Individuality is real in the way a wave is real. Each wave has its own distinct form, height, and motion. But the wave is not separate from the ocean that waves it. Your individuality is real, but it is not separate from the larger field of existence that produces it. Understanding this does not require any mystical experience or unusual mental state. It is a matter of noticing what has always been the case. You can verify it by paying careful attention to your actual experience right now. When you look for the boundary between yourself and your environment, you find no clear line. Your body is constantly exchanging matter and energy with its surroundings. The oxygen in your lungs was in the atmosphere seconds ago. The carbon in your cells came from food that was recently part of other organisms. The boundary of the skin is porous, not a rigid container. Watts expressed this insight in a characteristic way. "We do not come into this world," he said. "We come out of it like leaves from a tree. The universe peoples in the same way that the ocean waves. Each human being is a specific expression of the entire cosmos at a particular location. You are what the whole universe is doing at this specific point in space and time." This is not poetry or mysticism. It is a straightforward description of what physics and biology reveal about our situation. Part 2. Non-duality and the unity of opposites. Non-duality is the conceptual backbone of everything Watts taught. The term comes from the Sanskrit word Advaita, which means not two. This does not mean that everything is one in a simple, undifferentiated sense. It means that apparent opposites are actually aspects of a single process. They arise together, define each other, and cannot exist independently. Understanding this principle transforms how you perceive every aspect of existence. Consider the relationship between light and darkness. We habitually think of these as opposite forces that struggle against each other. But Watts pointed out that light and darkness are not opponents. They are poles of a single continuum called illumination. You cannot have one without the other being at least possible. The concept of light has no meaning whatsoever without the concept of darkness. They mutually define each other. Remove the possibility of darkness and the word light becomes meaningless. This applies to every pair of opposites you can name. Up implies down. Inside implies outside. Self implies other. Life implies death. Good implies evil. These are not separate things that happen to exist in the same universe. They are like the two ends of a single stick. You cannot pick up one end without picking up the other. Watts called this relationship polarity, and he considered it a fundamental law of nature. The deeper implication is that existence itself requires contrast to appear. A completely uniform field contains no information and no experience. Imagine a visual field of pure, undifferentiated white extending infinitely in all directions. After a few moments, it would become indistinguishable from pure darkness. You need edges, boundaries, and differences for anything to be perceived at all. Difference is not an imperfection added to some original uniformity. Difference is the necessary condition for existence to manifest. Watts drew heavily on Chinese philosophy to articulate this principle. The Taoist concept of yin and yang illustrates polarity perfectly. The familiar symbol shows two shapes nested together, each containing a dot of the other color. The light portion contains darkness within it. The dark portion contains light within it. Neither is pure, and neither exists without the other. The boundary between them is not a wall, but a dynamic curve showing continuous mutual arising. This is not mystical speculation, but a description of how things actually work. Biology provides concrete examples of this principle. Consider the relationship between predator and prey populations. When prey is abundant, predator numbers increase. When predators increase, they consume more prey, and prey numbers fall. When prey becomes scarce, predators starve and their numbers decline. When predators decline, prey can reproduce freely and become abundant again. Neither population exists independently. They oscillate together in a single system that requires both poles to function. The same pattern appears in neuroscience. Your nervous system operates through alternating excitation and inhibition. Neurons that fire are meaningless without neurons that remain silent. The signal requires contrast with the background to carry information. If all neurons fired simultaneously, you would experience a seizure, not perception. Consciousness itself depends on the interplay of activation and inhibition. Your brain does not seek pure activation. It seeks organized patterns of differential activity. Watts argued that Western culture systematically misunderstands polarity. We treat opposites as enemies rather than partners. We try to have pleasure without pain, life without death, good without evil. This creates what he called the illusion of the separate ego fighting the world. If you identify with only one side of a polarity, you automatically make the other side your enemy. You then spend your life in exhausting combat with something that cannot be eliminated. This is like trying to make a coin with only one side. No matter how hard you work, you will fail, because the task is logically impossible. The practical consequence is a fundamental shift in how you relate to difficulty. Most people treat negative experiences as problems to be solved permanently. They imagine a future state where only positive experiences remain, but this expectation guarantees perpetual frustration. You will never arrive at a state of permanent pleasure because pleasure requires contrast to be felt. The person who has never known sadness cannot truly appreciate joy. The person who has never struggled cannot recognize achievement. Watts suggested we stop trying to make the peaks higher and the valleys shallower. We should instead appreciate the whole wave pattern for what it is. This has direct implications for psychology and mental health. Anxiety often stems from resistance to the negative pole of experience. We become anxious about being anxious, afraid of being afraid. This creates feedback loops that amplify the original disturbance. Acceptance and commitment therapy, a contemporary psychological approach, works precisely by reducing this resistance. clients learn to accept difficult experiences rather than fighting them. This acceptance often reduces the intensity of the original suffering. Watts articulated this principle decades before it became standard clinical practice. Non-duality also undermines the common-sense notion of causation. We typically think of causes and effects as separate events linked by some mysterious force. The cause happens first, then it produces the effect afterward. But Watts argued that cause and effect are another polarity. They define each other mutually and arise together. You cannot have a cause without an effect, or an effect without a cause. They are two ways of describing a single event, not two separate events in sequence. Consider the relationship between buying and selling. You cannot have a purchase without a sale, or a sale without a purchase. These are not two separate events that happen to coincide. They are two names for the same transaction viewed from different perspectives. Similarly, what we call cause and what we call effect are two aspects of a single happening. Separating them is a trick of language and attention, not a feature of reality. Physics increasingly supports this view through field theory and process ontology. Events arise together from conditions rather than being pushed by preceding events. The unity of opposites has ethical implications that troubled some of Watts' critics. If good and evil are polarities that require each other, does this justify evil? Watts addressed this concern directly. Recognizing that light requires darkness does not mean you should turn off all the lights. Understanding the logical relationship between opposites does not eliminate your preferences. You can still prefer health to sickness, kindness to cruelty, peace to war. But you stop imagining that you can achieve absolute victory over the negative pole. This actually makes your efforts more effective because you work with reality rather than against it. The non-dual perspective also dissolves certain philosophical puzzles that have tormented Western thinkers. The mind-body problem asks how physical matter can produce conscious experience. But this assumes mind and body are fundamentally different substances that somehow interact. From a non-dual perspective, mind and body are aspects of a single process, like front and back. There is no problem of interaction because they were never separate to begin with. The problem exists only because we began with a faulty assumption of duality. Many philosophical problems dissolve rather than being solved when examined this way. They turn out to be artifacts of how we frame questions, not features of reality. Part 3. The Wisdom of Insecurity. In 1951, Watts published a book that directly addressed the anxiety of modern life. The Wisdom of Insecurity argued that our desperate search for security causes most of our misery. The more frantically we try to make ourselves safe, the more anxious we become. This is not because security is impossible to achieve. It is because the very project of seeking permanent security contradicts the nature of existence. Life is change, and demanding that change stop is demanding that life stop. The core insight is that psychological suffering usually comes from resistance to impermanence. Everything in your experience is in continuous flux. Your body is replacing its cells constantly. Your thoughts arise and pass away moment by moment. Your emotions shift like weather patterns. Your relationships evolve over time. Nothing in the field of experience stays the same from one instant to the next. Yet we persistently try to grasp particular states and make them permanent. This grasping takes many forms. We try to preserve youth, accumulate wealth, lock down relationships, and achieve lasting status. We attempt to insure ourselves against every possible misfortune. We plan obsessively for a future we cannot predict or control. Each of these activities stems from a refusal to accept the fundamentally fluid nature of existence. They are attempts to freeze the river of experience into solid ice. But the river keeps flowing regardless of our preferences. Our efforts to stop it merely exhaust us without changing anything fundamental. Watts traced this grasping to the ego illusion discussed in Part 1. If you believe yourself to be a separate, isolated thing, you naturally fear dissolution. The ego, by definition, is something that can be lost, diminished, or destroyed. Every threat to the ego feels like a threat to your very existence. So you spend enormous energy defending and protecting this imagined entity. But since the ego is itself an illusion, defending it is like defending a mirage. No amount of effort can make a mirage solid. The project is doomed from the start. The alternative is not reckless indifference to practical matters. Watts was clear that prudent planning and reasonable precautions remain appropriate. You should wear a seatbelt, save some money, and maintain your health. The problem is not practical action, but psychological attachment to outcomes. You can take out insurance without constantly worrying about disasters. You can plan for retirement without making your present happiness conditional on future security. The key distinction is between skillful action and anxious grasping. One responds intelligently to conditions, the other tries to control what cannot be controlled. This teaching connects directly to Buddhist psychology and the concept of dukkha. Dukkha is often translated as suffering, but more precisely means unsatisfactoriness or dis-ease. The Buddha taught that dukkha arises from tanha, which means craving or thirst. We crave pleasant experiences to continue and unpleasant experiences to end. This craving creates a constant friction between what is and what we want. The friction is the source of our psychological suffering. Watts presented this ancient analysis in contemporary Western terms accessible to modern audiences. Neuroscience has since identified the brain mechanisms underlying this process. The brain's reward system evolved to motivate seeking behavior. Dopamine signals anticipated pleasure, driving you toward goals. But the system is designed for pursuit, not satisfaction. Once you achieve a goal, dopamine levels drop and new desires arise. This is sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. You keep running, but never arrive at lasting satisfaction. The system worked well for survival in ancestral environments, but creates chronic dissatisfaction in modern contexts. Watts proposed that genuine security lies in embracing insecurity. This sounds paradoxical, but follows logically from his analysis. If you fully accept that nothing is permanent, you stop fighting against impermanence. If you stop fighting, the anxiety generated by the fight disappears. You do not become indifferent or passive. You become present to what is actually happening rather than lost in worry about what might happen. This presence allows for more effective action because you respond to actual circumstances. You are not distracted by imaginary threats that may never materialize. Living in the present moment is central to this approach, but widely misunderstood. It does not mean ignoring the future or refusing to learn from the past. It means recognizing that the present moment is the only place experience actually occurs. The past exists only as memory traces in the present. The future exists only as anticipation in the present. All of your planning happens now. All of your remembering happens now. There is never a time when it is not now. This insight has practical applications for anxiety disorders. Anxiety almost always involves mental time travel to imagined future scenarios. You project yourself into situations that have not yet occurred and may never occur. You then react emotionally as if these imagined situations were real. The body cannot distinguish between vividly imagined threats and actual threats. It produces stress hormones either way. Returning attention to present sensory experience interrupts this cycle. The present moment, examined directly, usually contains no emergency requiring panic. Watts acknowledged that accepting insecurity feels terrifying to the ego. The ego exists precisely as a project of securing itself against dissolution. Asking it to accept insecurity feels like asking it to commit suicide. This is why genuine transformation usually involves what feels like a kind of death. But what dies is not you. What dies is a false image of yourself that was causing suffering. The organism continues perfectly well without the anxious grasping of the ego. In fact, it functions better because energy formerly spent on defense becomes available for living. Economic behavior demonstrates the futility of seeking absolute security. Beyond a certain point, additional wealth does not increase happiness. Research consistently shows that once basic needs are met, more money adds little to well-being. Yet people continue accumulating far beyond any practical necessity. They are seeking psychological security through material means. But psychological security cannot be purchased because insecurity is built into the structure of ego consciousness. A billionaire with strong ego identification feels as insecure as anyone else, often more so because they have more to lose. The wisdom of insecurity also applies to beliefs and opinions. People cling to ideologies and worldviews as sources of psychological security. They become defensive when their beliefs are questioned because questioning feels threatening. But genuine understanding requires willingness to revise beliefs in light of new evidence. If you grip your beliefs tightly, you cannot learn. Intellectual security purchased at the cost of closed-mindedness is no security at all. It merely blinds you to information that might require change. Watts advocated holding beliefs lightly as working hypotheses rather than final truths. Part 4. Spontaneity and Wu Wei. The Chinese concept of Wu Wei was central to Watts' practical philosophy. The term literally translates as non-action or non-doing. But this translation is misleading if you interpret it as passivity or laziness. Wu Wei actually means action that does not force or struggle against the natural grain. It is action in harmony with the way things actually work rather than against it. Watts considered it one of the most practically useful concepts he encountered in Asian thought. Consider how water moves through a landscape. It does not blast through obstacles by sheer force. It finds the path of least resistance, flowing around rocks and through valleys. Yet over time, water carves canyons and shapes entire continents. This is Wu Wei in action. The water does not try to be powerful. It simply follows its nature consistently, and immense results follow. Effort is present, but struggle is absent. This principle applies directly to human action and skill development. When you first learn any complex skill, your movements are awkward and forced. A beginning musician grips the instrument tightly and produces strained sounds. A novice writer overthinks every sentence and produces stilted prose. But as skill develops, effort gradually disappears. The expert musician plays fluidly, seemingly without trying. The mature writer produces sentences that flow naturally from thought to page. Mastery looks effortless precisely because the struggle against resistance has been overcome. Watts connected Wu Wei to the Western concept of spontaneity. Genuine spontaneity is not random impulsiveness, but trusting the organism's natural intelligence. Your body knows how to digest food without conscious direction. Your immune system fights pathogens without your awareness. Your brain processes visual information into coherent perception automatically. These processes are spontaneous in the sense that they happen by themselves. Wu Wei extends this trust to deliberate action. You act from the whole organism rather than from the anxious control of the ego. This has measurable correlates in psychology and neuroscience. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi studied what he called flow states. Flow occurs when skill level matches challenge level in an engaging activity. During flow, the sense of separate self diminishes. Time perception changes. Action and awareness merge into a single, seamless process. People report these experiences as among the most satisfying in their lives. Flow is essentially the Western scientific description of Wu Wei in action. The neuroscience of flow involves reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. This brain region handles self-monitoring, planning, and impulse control. When it quiets, the hypercritical inner voice subsides. Action becomes less deliberate and more responsive to actual conditions. Top athletes describe this as letting the body take over. Musicians describe it as getting out of their own way. The conscious ego steps back and deeper capacities emerge. This is precisely what Watts meant by spontaneous action arising from the whole organism. Wu Wei challenges the Western assumption that improvement requires more effort. We tend to believe that trying harder produces better results. If something is not working, we increase force and intensity, but often this additional effort creates counterproductive tension. The harder you try to fall asleep, the more awake you become. The more desperately you try to be funny, the less amusing you are. The more forcefully you try to relax, the more tense you feel. These paradoxes reveal the limits of willful control. Watts related this to the structure of the nervous system itself. The voluntary nervous system handles actions you consciously control. The involuntary nervous system handles functions that operate without conscious direction. Many processes involve both systems in complex interaction. You can voluntarily take a breath, but breathing also happens automatically. Problems arise when the voluntary system interferes excessively with functions better left to involuntary regulation. The ego tries to control things that work better without its interference. Wu Wei is the art of knowing when to control and when to let be. This principle extends to social and political organization. Watts was deeply skeptical of attempts to engineer society through centralized control. He observed that complex systems often regulate themselves better than any planner could manage. Markets, ecosystems, and cultures exhibit spontaneous order that emerges without design. Heavy-handed intervention often produces unintended consequences worse than the original problem. This does not mean all intervention is wrong. It means intervention should work with systemic tendencies rather than against them. Good governance, like good medicine, does as little as necessary to let natural healing proceed. The Taoist sage does not impose order, but cultivates conditions where order emerges naturally. A gardener cannot force plants to grow. But a gardener can prepare soil, provide water, and remove weeds. The growing happens by itself when conditions are right. This is the essence of Wu Wei, applied to leadership and management. You create contexts where good outcomes can emerge spontaneously. You remove obstacles rather than forcing results. You trust in processes you do not fully understand or control. Critics have argued that Wu Wei can become an excuse for inaction when action is needed. This is a valid concern that Watts addressed. Wu Wei is not about avoiding effort, but about avoiding forced effort. Sometimes appropriate action requires significant exertion. A firefighter rushing into a burning building is not violating Wu Wei. The action matches the situation and arises spontaneously from the organism's response to danger. Wu Wei is violated when you force yourself to act against your genuine perception of what is needed. It is violated when ego drives action rather than intelligent response to actual conditions. Watts also connected Wu Wei to creativity and artistic production. Artists consistently report that their best work feels received rather than manufactured. They describe getting into a state where ideas flow without obstruction. The conscious mind sets up conditions and then steps aside. Something deeper takes over and produces results the ego could never have planned. This is not mysticism, but accurate phenomenology of creative process. Forced creativity produces strained, mechanical results. Spontaneous creativity produces work that feels alive and organic. Part 5. The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. In 1966, Watts published what he considered his most important book. The book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, synthesized his decades of study and teaching. Its central claim is that every culture maintains a powerful prohibition against genuine self-knowledge. This taboo is not explicitly stated but woven into the fabric of language, education, and social life. We are systematically prevented from recognizing our true nature. The prevention is so thorough that we do not even notice we are being prevented. The taboo conceals a specific insight that Watts believed would transform human life. The insight is that your fundamental identity is not the separate ego, but the entire field of existence. You are not a stranger who arrived in this universe from somewhere else. You are what the universe is doing at this particular location. Just as a wave is something the ocean does, you are something the cosmos does. Your deepest self is identical with the ultimate reality, whatever that reality turns out to be. This is the secret, hidden by the taboo. Watts connected this to the Hindu concept of Brahman and Atman. Brahman is the ultimate ground of all existence, the totality of what is. Atman is the innermost self, what you really are behind all appearances. The central teaching of Vedanta philosophy is that Brahman and Atman are identical. Your true self is not different from the ultimate reality. The apparent separation between individual and cosmos is illusion. This teaching appears in the famous phrase Tat Tvam Asi, meaning you are that. What you most fundamentally are is what everything most fundamentally is. Why would society maintain a taboo against this insight? Watts argued that social control depends on people believing they are separate egos. A separate ego can be threatened, rewarded, punished, and manipulated. It can be made to compete with other egos and feel inferior or superior. It can be driven by fear of death and desire for approval. All of these mechanisms cease to function if people recognize their deeper identity. You cannot threaten someone who has already died to their ego. You cannot bribe someone who already possesses everything because they are everything. The taboo begins in early childhood through the process of socialization. Parents and teachers tell children who they are. They assign names, roles, and boundaries. They reward certain behaviors and punish others. The child learns to identify with a particular image of themselves. This image becomes the ego, the social self that navigates the human world. By the time the child reaches adulthood, the identification is so complete that alternatives seem unthinkable. The prison becomes invisible because the prisoner cannot remember freedom. Language reinforces the taboo at every turn. The structure of grammar assumes separate subjects performing actions on separate objects. Every sentence reiterates the division between self and world. When you say, "I see the tree," language implies a seer separate from the seeing and the seen. But in actual experience, there is only seeing happening. The division into subject, verb, and object is a linguistic convention, not a feature of perception itself. Yet we speak thousands of sentences daily, each one reinforcing the illusion of separation. The taboo is built into the very tools we use to think. Religious institutions often reinforce, rather than dissolve, the taboo. Watts was critical of religions that maintain a fundamental gap between humans and the divine. In these systems, claiming identity with God is the ultimate heresy. The mystic who reports direct experience of unity is often persecuted. Al-Hallaj was executed in 10th century Baghdad for declaring, "I am the truth." Meister Eckhart was tried for heresy in 14th century Europe for similar claims. Religions that should reveal our true nature instead guard the taboo most fiercely. They transform liberation into a distant goal that requires institutional mediation. Yet the insight keeps reappearing throughout human history. Mystics in every tradition report the same fundamental discovery. Behind the surface differences of doctrine and practice, they describe the same experience. The sense of separate selfhood dissolves, and unity with existence becomes directly apparent. William James documented this pattern in his classic study of religious experience. Aldous Huxley called it the perennial philosophy, the common core of all genuine spirituality. Watts saw his work as making this perennial insight available without religious trappings. He wanted to show that it aligns with scientific understanding rather than contradicting it. The taboo has practical consequences beyond psychological suffering. If you believe yourself separate from the world, you will exploit it without compunction. Environmental destruction follows logically from a worldview of separation. You do not saw off the branch you are sitting on if you know you are sitting on it. But if you think the branch is other than yourself, you might saw it for lumber. The ecological crisis, Watts argued, is a direct consequence of the taboo against self-knowledge. We destroy nature because we do not recognize nature as our own deeper self. Overcoming the taboo is therefore not merely personal therapy, but planetary necessity. How does one see through the taboo? Watts emphasized that this is not about acquiring new information or beliefs. You already are what you seek to discover. The problem is not absence, but overlooking. It is like searching everywhere for your glasses while they are on your face. No effort can help you find what you never lost. What is required is a kind of relaxation or giving up of the search. When you stop looking for yourself as an object among objects, what you are becomes obvious. This creates a paradox that frustrated many of Watts' students. If seeking prevents finding, how can you intentionally arrive at the insight? Watts acknowledged this paradox and considered it inherent to the situation. The ego cannot transcend itself through ego effort. Any technique or practice pursued by the ego to eliminate the ego is itself an ego activity. Yet doing nothing also fails because passive waiting is still a strategy. The way out is recognizing that you are already out. There is no door to walk through because there are no walls. Part 6. Time, Death, and the Eternal Present. Watts devoted significant attention to how we experience and think about time. Our relationship with time, he argued, is central to our psychological suffering. We imagine time as a line stretching from past through present to future. We picture ourselves moving along this line, leaving the past behind and approaching the future. But this picture does not match the structure of actual experience. It is an abstraction we have mistaken for reality. The only time you ever actually experience is the present moment. The past does not exist as an experienceable reality. It exists only as memory traces, and memory is a present experience. When you remember yesterday, the remembering is happening now. The future does not exist as an experienceable reality. It exists only as anticipation, and anticipation is also a present experience. When you imagine tomorrow, the imagining is happening now. Past and future are categories of thought, not dimensions of experience. This is not a philosophical quibble, but a fundamental reorientation. Most psychological suffering involves mental time travel. We regret the past and worry about the future. We wish things had been different and fear things might go wrong. But all of this rumination happens in the present while missing the present. We are so busy mentally elsewhere that we fail to inhabit the only moment that actually exists. This mental absence is the core of what's meant by not knowing who you are. You are this present experiencing, and you keep overlooking it by thinking about other times. The linear picture of time also distorts our understanding of death. We imagine death as a future event waiting for us at the end of the line. We approach it with dread, seeing it as the ultimate loss. But Watts pointed out several problems with this picture. First, you cannot actually experience your own death as an event. Experience requires an experiencer, and death is the cessation of experiencing. What you fear when you fear death is not an experience, but the absence of experience. Yet the absence of experience is not itself experienceable. Second, you have already experienced something very like death. Before you were born, you were not experiencing anything. Was this a terrible state of deprivation? Obviously not, because there was no one there to be deprived. Death is simply the return to that state. If the billions of years before your birth were not troubling, why should the years after your death be troubling? The fear of death depends on imaging yourself as present to experience your own absence. This is a logical confusion, not a rational concern. Watts also questioned the assumption that personal identity persists continuously through time. We assume that the same self exists from childhood to old age. But examination reveals no such continuous entity. Your body has replaced virtually all of its atoms since childhood. Your thoughts, beliefs, and personality have changed radically. What connects the infant you were to the adult you are? Only a narrative thread, a story of continuity woven from disconnected moments. The self that seems to persist is itself a construction renewed moment by moment. If the self is continually reconstructed, death becomes less significant than it appears. You are already dying and being reborn each moment. The person you were yesterday no longer exists. A slightly different person woke up today with memories of being that previous person. This process has been occurring since birth and will continue until the body stops. Death is simply when the process stops, rather than some sudden catastrophe. What you most fear has already happened countless times without troubling you at all. You simply did not notice because the narrative of continuity concealed it. This perspective connects to Buddhist teachings on impermanence and momentariness. Some Buddhist schools analyze experience into discrete moments, arising and passing with extreme rapidity. Each moment is a complete experience that does not persist into the next. What seems like continuous experience is actually a rapid sequence of discontinuous events. The sense of continuity is like the sense of motion in a film, produced by rapidly displayed still images. Understanding this is called seeing into impermanence, and it is considered liberating. You stop grasping at what cannot be held because you recognize that nothing can be held. Everything is already slipping away, and that is perfectly fine. Watts connected these insights to the concept of the eternal now found in various mystical traditions. Eternity, properly understood, is not endless duration, but timelessness. It is not a very long time, but the absence of temporal limitation. The present moment, when fully inhabited, has this quality of eternity. It is not located on a timeline between past and future. It is where past and future appear as mental constructs. Mystics who report experiences of eternity are not claiming to have lived for billions of years. They are describing a quality of present experience when mental time travel stops. Practical implications follow from this analysis. If only the present moment is real, then fullness of life depends on presence to this moment. Planning for the future is appropriate, but only when done with attention in the present. Learning from the past is appropriate, but only when the learning happens now. The mistake is living mentally in past or future while missing the present that contains them. This is what meditation traditions cultivate, the capacity to remain present to present experience. Watts considered this capacity the essence of sanity and the foundation of genuine happiness. Nothing else needs to happen because this is already it. Death anxiety, when examined closely, often turns out to be something else in disguise. What people actually fear is often not non-existence, but the process of dying. They fear pain, disability, loss of control, or being a burden. These are concerns about experiences, not about the absence of experience. Addressing them directly is more useful than abstract worrying about death itself. Other times, death anxiety masks unlived life. We fear death because we have not yet fully lived and time is running out. The solution is not to avoid thinking about death, but to start living fully now. Part 7. Psychotherapy, East and West. In 1961, Watts published a systematic comparison of Western psychotherapy and Eastern liberation paths. Psychotherapy, East and West, argued that these apparently different enterprises share a common goal. Both aim to free human beings from unnecessary suffering caused by false beliefs about themselves. The methods differ, but the fundamental diagnosis is remarkably similar. Watts proposed that understanding this convergence could improve both approaches. Western psychotherapy emerged in the late 19th century with Freud's psychoanalysis. Freud proposed that neurotic suffering stems from conflicts between different parts of the psyche. The conscious ego tries to manage demands from primitive drives, social expectations, and an internalized moral authority. When these demands conflict, the ego uses defense mechanisms that create symptoms. Therapy involves making unconscious conflicts conscious so they can be resolved rationally. The goal is a stronger, more integrated ego that can manage life more effectively. Eastern approaches, particularly Buddhism and Vedanta, start from a different premise. The problem is not weak ego integration, but ego identification itself. We suffer because we believe ourselves to be a separate entity that must defend itself against the world. This belief is the fundamental error from which all neurotic symptoms derive. Liberation comes not from strengthening the ego, but from seeing through it entirely. When you recognize that the separate self is an illusion, the conflicts it generates dissolve spontaneously. Watts argued that these approaches are complementary rather than contradictory. Western therapy addresses the structure and functioning of the ego on its own terms. It helps people who are so damaged that they cannot function in society. A person experiencing psychotic fragmentation needs ego integration before ego transcendence becomes relevant. You cannot see through a self you have not yet consolidated. In this sense, psychotherapy can be preparation for liberation rather than its opposite. But Watts also saw limitations in conventional therapy's goals. If therapy aims only at better adjustment to social norms, it falls short of genuine liberation. Society itself may be insane in certain respects. Adjusting perfectly to an insane society is not health, but a different kind of pathology. The person who never questions the game is not necessarily healthier than the person who struggles with it. Eastern approaches recognize that social convention itself is part of the problem. True liberation requires seeing through social roles, not just playing them more skillfully. Watts identified the double bind as a key concept linking East and West. A double bind occurs when you receive contradictory commands that you cannot escape or comment on. Gregory Bateson and his colleagues developed this concept while studying schizophrenia. They found that some families create impossible situations where the child is wrong, no matter what they do. Watts argued that society places everyone in a pervasive double bind regarding the self. You are commanded to be yourself while also being commanded what yourself should be. You must be spontaneous on demand, which is a logical impossibility. This built-in contradiction generates the neurotic knots that therapy tries to untangle. Eastern methods specialize in dissolving double binds by exposing their logical structure. The Zen koan is a classic example. The student receives an impossible question, like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? No conceptual answer satisfies the teacher. The student tries progressively harder until eventually giving up completely. In that exhaustion, the mind stops grasping and something shifts. The double bind is not solved but dissolved when its structure becomes transparent. This is liberation through understanding rather than through effort. Watts saw certain developments in Western therapy as convergent with Eastern insights. Carl Rogers's client-centered therapy emphasizes unconditional positive regard. The therapist accepts the client completely without trying to fix or change them. This acceptance paradoxically facilitates change more effectively than direct intervention. The principle resembles Wu Wei. Stop forcing and natural healing occurs. Gestalt therapy's focus on present-moment awareness also parallels Eastern mindfulness practices. Fritz Perls emphasize staying with current experience rather than analyzing the past. These developments suggest Western therapy was discovering Eastern principles independently. The relationship between therapist and guru also interested Watts. Both occupy a role of authority that must eventually be relinquished. A therapist who creates dependency has failed. The goal is to make the client capable of functioning without the therapist. Similarly, a genuine spiritual teacher aims at their own obsolescence. The student who permanently needs the teacher has not actually learned. Both relationships are transitional structures meant to dissolve themselves. This contrasts with authoritarian systems where leaders maintain control indefinitely. Watts was critical of the medical model that dominated psychiatry in his era. Treating psychological suffering as disease implies something is wrong that must be corrected. But much suffering results from perfectly natural processes misunderstood by the sufferer. Grief is not a disease, it is a healthy response to loss. Anxiety about mortality is not a disease, it is a natural confrontation with the human condition. Medicalizing these experiences pathologizes normal humanity. It also empowers professionals to define what counts as health, which is a social and political act. The pharmaceutical revolution in psychiatry would have troubled Watts greatly. Medicating suffering into invisibility does not address its underlying causes. A person numbed by tranquilizers is not liberated. They are sedated. This is not to say medication is never appropriate. Severe conditions often require biochemical intervention as part of treatment. But medication alone, without understanding, is management rather than cure. Watts would likely argue that contemporary psychiatry has moved further from liberation, not closer. It treats the ego's distress while reinforcing the ego structure that generates distress. Part 8. The Double Bind of Human Existence. Watts returned repeatedly to the concept of the double bind because it illuminates the structure of human suffering. A double bind is not merely a dilemma or difficult choice. It is a situation where every possible response is punished, including the response of doing nothing. Furthermore, you are forbidden from recognizing or commenting on the trap itself. This creates a situation of profound psychological distortion with no apparent exit. The classic example occurs in certain dysfunctional families. A mother says to her child, "Come, give me a hug," in a tone and posture that communicates rejection. If the child approaches, the mother stiffens and the child feels rebuffed. If the child stays away, the mother says, "You never show me any affection." The child cannot win and cannot leave the game. Furthermore, calling attention to the contradiction is itself punished as disrespectful or crazy. The child must somehow maintain relationship with a figure sending impossible messages. This situation, repeated thousands of times, produces psychological symptoms. Watts argued that society places everyone in analogous double binds from birth. Consider the command to be yourself. This is offered as liberating advice, but examine its structure. If you try to be yourself, you are following a command, which means you are not being yourself spontaneously. If you ignore the command, you have still responded to it by ignoring it. The very attempt to be spontaneous is a contradiction because genuine spontaneity cannot be deliberately produced. You are required to do voluntarily what can only happen involuntarily. This is a logical trap with no exit within its own terms. The command to love provides another example. You shall love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself. These are presented as commandments, which implies that disobedience is possible and punishable. But love, by definition, must be freely given. Commanded love is not love, but forced performance. If you feel you must love to avoid punishment, you are motivated by fear, not love. The commandment undermines the very thing it commands. You are punished if you do not love, but you cannot love under threat of punishment. Perhaps the deepest double bind concerns the ego itself. Society tells you that you are a separate, responsible self. You are held accountable for your actions as if you chose them freely, but at the same time you are told what kind of self to be. You did not choose your body, your parents, your native language, or your early conditioning. You did not choose the neurological structures that generate your thoughts and impulses. Yet you are blamed for what this unchosen apparatus produces. You must be what you already are, as if you had a choice about it. The religious version of this bind concerns salvation and damnation. You are told that you must achieve salvation through your own sincere effort. But sincere effort cannot be manufactured deliberately. If you try to be sincere in order to be saved, your sincerity is corrupted by ulterior motive. You are supposed to love God for God's own sake, not for the reward. But you cannot forget the promised reward while still motivated by the teaching that describes it. The requirement to forget the reward while pursuing it is another impossible command. Much religious anxiety stems from this unacknowledged logical trap. Watts proposed that recognizing the double bind structure is already the beginning of release. The bind operates only so long as its victim cannot see it as a bind. Once you clearly perceive the logical impossibility, you stop trying to solve it within its own terms. You realize that no move works because the game is rigged. This realization produces what might be called creative frustration. You give up in a particular way that opens a new dimension. The energy formerly spent on the impossible task becomes available for something else. This shift is what Eastern traditions mean by liberation or enlightenment. The Zen koan practice is designed specifically to induce this shift. The teacher gives an impossible problem and rejects every answer. The student struggles, bringing all their intellectual resources to bear. Nothing works. Eventually, something breaks and the student stops trying in the usual way. What emerges is not an answer, but a different relationship to the question itself. The student sees that the problem was a finger pointing at the moon. The point was never to solve it, but to exhaust the solving mechanism. This has practical applications beyond spiritual development. Many personal problems are disguised double binds that cannot be solved on their own terms. Insomnia often works this way. You try to fall asleep, but trying is a mode of wakefulness. The harder you try, the more awake you become. Solution comes only when you give up trying and simply remain with the experience of being awake. Paradoxically, this acceptance often leads to sleep more quickly than any sleep-seeking strategy. The bind dissolves when you stop fighting it. Social double binds also respond to this approach. Many work environments trap employees in contradictory demands. Take initiative, but do not overstep your role. Work independently, but check every decision with your supervisor. These binds create chronic stress that no amount of skill can resolve. Recognizing that the system itself is contradictory provides relief. You stop blaming yourself for failing to meet impossible demands. You may still have to navigate the situation, but you do so without the added burden of self-recrimination. Part 9. Nature, Ecology and Interconnectedness. Watts was an early advocate for ecological awareness before environmentalism became mainstream. His perspective on ecology was not merely political, but deeply philosophical. He argued that environmental destruction stems directly from the illusion of the separate self. If you experience yourself as apart from nature, you will inevitably treat nature as a resource to exploit. Solving ecological problems, therefore, requires a shift in identity, not just better technology or policy. The Western worldview traditionally places humans outside and above nature. In the Judeo-Christian narrative, humans are given dominion over the earth. Nature exists to serve human purposes. This hierarchical view was reinforced by the scientific revolution's mechanistic philosophy. Nature became a machine to be understood, controlled, and exploited for human benefit. Progress was measured by the degree to which we subdued natural forces. Neither religious nor scientific frameworks encouraged identification with the natural world. Both assumed fundamental separation between human and non-human. Watts pointed out that this view contradicts basic biology. You are not separate from your environment. You are a function of your environment. Your body requires constant exchange with the atmosphere, biosphere, and hydrosphere. The oxygen in your lungs was produced by plants and photosynthetic bacteria. The carbon in your cells came from food chains extending throughout the ecosystem. The water in your tissues circulates through the planetary hydrological cycle. Drawing a boundary between yourself and this larger system is arbitrary and misleading. You are no more separate from nature than a wave is separate from the ocean. What we call the environment is actually the larger body we inhabit. The skin is not a boundary between self and world, but a bridge connecting them. It evolved not to isolate us, but to facilitate exchange with surroundings. We breathe the world in and out continuously. We eat portions of the world and excrete them back. We absorb energy from the sun through the mediation of plants and other organisms. This throughput is what keeps us alive. Blocking it means death within minutes. The separate self is a momentary pattern in an ongoing flow, not a thing apart from the flow. Watts used the term ecological awareness to describe the experiential recognition of this interconnection. This awareness is not merely intellectual assent to environmental facts. It is a shift in the felt sense of identity and boundary. You begin to experience yourself as continuous with the living world rather than opposed to it. Harming nature then feels like harming yourself, because it is harming yourself. This felt understanding motivates ecological behavior more powerfully than abstract arguments. You do not need to be persuaded to protect your own body. Extending felt identity to include the larger environment produces the same natural protectiveness. Systems theory and cybernetics provided Watts with scientific frameworks for understanding interconnection. He drew on the work of Norbert Wiener, Gregory Bateson and others working in these fields. Systems theory studies how components interact to form functional wholes. It emphasizes feedback loops, emergent properties, and non-linear causation. These concepts describe how ecosystems work far better than linear mechanistic models. An ecosystem is not a machine with separable parts, but a network of mutual dependencies. Change one element, and effects ripple throughout the entire system. Watts saw systems thinking as science, catching up with what Eastern philosophy always knew. The body itself is an ecosystem of extraordinary complexity. Your gut contains trillions of bacteria essential for digestion and immune function. Your cells harbour mitochondria that were once free-living organisms. What you call your body is actually a colony of cooperating entities. Boundaries between self and other break down even at this level of analysis. You are not one organism, but a vast community that functions as one. Recognizing this undermines the intuition of being a single separate thing. Identity becomes distributed across multiple levels of organization. Watts anticipated many themes that became central to environmental philosophy. The deep ecology movement, emerging in the 1970s, developed similar ideas systematically. Arnonaeus distinguished shallow environmentalism, which protects nature for human use, from deep ecology. Deep ecology holds that nature has intrinsic value independent of human purposes. This requires expanding identification beyond the human to include all living systems. Watts had articulated this expansion of identity a decade earlier. His influence on environmental thought, while not always acknowledged, was significant. Climate change presents the ultimate test of ecological awareness. It is a problem created by billions of individual decisions that seem harmless in isolation. Each person driving a car or using electricity contributes negligibly to the global total. Yet the aggregate effect threatens the stability of the entire biosphere. Addressing it requires recognizing that individual and collective are not separate. What each person does is what humanity does. The problem and the solution both exist at the level of the species, not just the individual. This is precisely the shift in identity Watts advocated. Technology, Watts argued, is not inherently the enemy of nature. The problem is the spirit in which technology is developed and deployed. Technology conceived as a weapon against nature produces environmental destruction. Technology conceived as an extension of natural processes could produce integration. The difference lies not in the tools, but in the consciousness using them. Renewable energy, ecological design, and regenerative agriculture demonstrate technology aligned with natural systems. These approaches treat nature as a teacher rather than an enemy to be conquered. Watts would likely see them as expressions of ecological awareness in practical form. Part 10. Language, Thought, and the Limits of Words. Watts was deeply interested in how language shapes thought and constructs our experience of reality. He drew on the work of Alfred Korzybski, the founder of general semantics. Korzybski argued that the map is not the territory. Our verbal descriptions of reality are not reality itself, but symbolic representations. Confusing the map with the territory, words with things, generates endless problems. Much human suffering stems from this basic category confusion. Language carves the continuous flow of experience into discrete chunks. We learn nouns that name apparently separate things: tree, bird, mountain, person. This linguistic segmentation creates the impression that reality consists of distinct objects, but examination reveals no clear boundaries in nature itself. Where exactly does the mountain end and the valley begin? Where does the tree end and the soil begin? These boundaries are conventional, not natural. We impose them through our linguistic categories, then forget we imposed them. The subject-verb-object structure of Indo-European languages is particularly significant. Every sentence requires an agent performing an action on something else. I see the table. She throws the ball. This structure presupposes separate entities interacting across a gap. But in actual experience, seeing and seen arise together in a unified field. There is no seer separate from the seeing. Language creates this separation through its very grammar, not because reality contains it. Watts pointed out that other languages structure experience differently. Chinese, for example, is more process-oriented than English. It emphasizes verbs and relationships over nouns and substances. The Hopi language, according to linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf, structures time differently than European languages. These differences suggest that our experience of reality depends partly on our linguistic tools. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as it came to be called, proposed that language shapes cognition. Watts found this hypothesis consistent with his understanding of how the ego is constructed linguistically. Different languages would produce different egos and different experienced worlds. The word is not the thing, but we constantly react to words as if they were things. This is most obvious with emotionally charged words. Hearing an insult produces physiological stress responses even though only sounds occurred. Reading threatening words activates the same brain regions as encountering actual threats. We respond to symbols as if they were the realities they represent. This confusion gives language enormous power over our inner states. Propaganda, advertising, and manipulation of all kinds exploit this confusion. We can be controlled through words because we do not distinguish words from reality. Watts also emphasized what language cannot capture. Certain aspects of experience resist verbal description entirely. How do you describe the taste of salt to someone who has never tasted it? How do you convey the experience of color to someone blind from birth? These experiences are known directly but cannot be transmitted through words. The same applies to states of consciousness, explored in meditation and contemplation. Mystics consistently report that their experiences are ineffable beyond words. This is not evasion, but accurate acknowledgement of linguistic limits. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. This opening line of the Tao Te Ching expresses the fundamental limitation Watts explored. Ultimate reality, whatever it is, cannot be captured in concepts and descriptions. Words are fingers pointing at the moon, as the Zen saying goes. Confusing the finger with the moon is the basic mistake. Religious doctrines, philosophical systems, and scientific theories are all fingers. They may point accurately, but they are not themselves the moon they indicate. Grasping them tightly misses the point entirely. This does not mean language is useless or should be abandoned. Watts was a brilliant user of language who valued its power deeply. The point is to use language skillfully while remembering its limitations. A map can help you navigate terrain even though it is not the terrain. Problems arise only when you forget the difference. Similarly, concepts and theories can illuminate reality without being confused with reality. The skillful thinker moves fluidly between map and territory. They use words as tools rather than mistaking words for truths. Meditation practices often work by interrupting the verbal stream. The constant inner monologue maintains the ego construction moment by moment. When that monologue stops, even briefly, something shifts. Experience continues, but the narrative overlay disappears. What remains is direct perception without conceptual mediation. Objects are no longer named and categorized instantaneously. They appear in their original suchness before language carves them into familiar forms. This is sometimes called beginner's mind, or seeing with fresh eyes. Watts frequently used paradoxical language deliberately to short-circuit conceptual thinking. Statements like, "The only way to make sense of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance resist logical analysis." Their meaning cannot be extracted through parsing. They work by provoking a shift in the mode of understanding itself. Zen koans operate the same way. What is your original face before your parents were born? This is not a question that wants a conceptual answer. It wants to exhaust conceptual effort and induce a different kind of knowing. The relationship between thought and reality remains philosophically controversial. Watts did not claim to resolve debates between realists and constructivists. He was more interested in the practical consequences of recognizing linguistic limitations. If you stop mistaking your thoughts for reality, you suffer less and perceive more clearly. If you hold your beliefs lightly, you can revise them when evidence warrants. If you recognize that your self-concept is made of words, you are less imprisoned by it. These practical benefits do not depend on solving abstract philosophical problems. They depend only on developing a more flexible relationship with your own thinking. Part 11. The ceramic and fully automatic models. Watts identified two dominant worldviews that shape how Western civilization understands existence. He called these the ceramic model and the fully automatic model. Both are myths in the deep sense of foundational stories that organize perception and behavior. Neither is presented as a myth. Each claims to be obvious truth. Understanding these models reveals the hidden assumptions that generate our characteristic problems. Watts proposed an alternative he called the dramatic model, which resolves their difficulties. The ceramic model derives from the creation narrative in Genesis. A divine craftsman shapes the world from raw material, like a potter moulding clay. The Creator is separate from and superior to the creation. Humans are artifacts made by this external God, who owns them and issues commands. The universe is fundamentally dead matter organized by an outside intelligence. Meaning and purpose are imposed from beyond rather than inherent in existence itself. This model dominated Western thought for over 1,000 years. Its influence persists even among people who no longer consciously believe its theological version. The ceramic model has specific psychological consequences. If you are a creature made by an external God, you exist on probation. You must earn your right to continue existing by meeting the Creator's demands. Life becomes a test, with pass or fail consequences extending into eternity. This produces chronic anxiety about performance and worthiness. You can never fully relax because the judge is always watching. Guilt becomes a fundamental feature of consciousness because perfection is demanded but impossible. The model sets up inevitable failure and perpetual striving to avoid punishment. The fully automatic model emerged when science displaced theology as the authority on reality. Scientists in the 17th through 19th centuries rejected the divine craftsman. But they retained the assumption that matter is fundamentally dead and mechanical. The universe became a vast machine operating according to blind physical laws. No intelligence designed it. It simply happened through chance and necessity. Life evolved through random variation and natural selection, not purpose. Consciousness is an accident, a byproduct of complex matter that serves no cosmic function. You are, as one biologist put it, a survival machine for your genes. The fully automatic model also has psychological consequences. If you are a meaningless accident in a blind universe, existence becomes absurd. Nothing you do ultimately matters because everything ends in entropy and heat death. Values have no grounding in reality. They are merely human projections. This produces either despair or frantic distraction from the underlying emptiness. Many people oscillate between these responses without finding stable ground. The ceramic model at least offered meaning, even if oppressive meaning. The fully automatic model removes even that consolation. Watts observed that these two models share a crucial assumption. Both treat the universe as fundamentally dead stuff that requires external animation. In the ceramic model, God breathes life into clay. In the fully automatic model, organization somehow emerges from lifeless particles. Neither model starts from the recognition that existence is inherently alive and aware. Both assume consciousness is a rare anomaly in a basically unconscious cosmos. This shared assumption is what Watts challenged most directly. He proposed instead that consciousness is fundamental, not derivative. The dramatic model offers a different starting point. It derives from Hindu philosophy, particularly the concept of Leela, or divine play. In this view, the universe is not made by a separate creator, but is itself the creative process. Existence plays at being all the forms we observe, including us. There is no dead matter waiting to be animated. What we call matter is consciousness, appearing in a particular mode. The distinction between creator and creation dissolves because they are aspects of one process. You are not a creature made by God. You are what God is doing here. The dramatic model uses the metaphor of drama deliberately. In a play, the actor becomes the character while remaining the actor. The actor is not deceived about their identity, yet they genuinely inhabit the role. Similarly, existence plays at being separate individuals while never ceasing to be existence. The forgetting is part of the game, like children pretending to be pirates who genuinely feel the adventure. Liberation is remembering what you always were, not becoming something new. The drama does not end when you remember. It simply becomes play rather than compulsion. You continue acting your role, but without the anxiety of taking it with absolute seriousness. This model has radically different psychological implications. If existence is playing at being you, you are not on trial. There is no external judge, because the player and the played are one. Guilt becomes unnecessary because there is no one to offend. Life is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. Success and failure are both moves in the game, equally valid as experiences. This does not eliminate preference or effort, but removes the desperate quality of striving. You can play wholeheartedly without the terror of ultimate consequences. Critics argued that the dramatic model could justify irresponsibility and cruelty. If everything is just a game, why not do whatever you want? Watts responded that this objection misunderstands the nature of genuine play. Children playing do not want to destroy the game. They want to continue playing. Cruelty destroys the conditions that make rich experience possible. It is bad gameplay, not forbidden behavior. Understanding that others are also the player naturally produces compassion. Hurting others is literally hurting yourself when you recognize the underlying unity. The dramatic model also reframes the relationship with death. In the ceramic model, death is failure or punishment. In the fully automatic model, death is simply cessation, the end of accidental consciousness. In the dramatic model, death is the end of one role, not the end of the player. The actor exits this character and will enter others. This is not conventional reincarnation with a persistent soul moving between bodies. It is more like the ocean withdrawing one wave and producing another. The continuity is at the level of the ocean, not the individual wave. Part 12. God, Religion, and the Cosmic Drama. Watts had a complex relationship with religion throughout his life. He trained as an Episcopal priest and served in ministry before leaving to pursue broader inquiries. He never rejected the religious impulse itself, only certain forms it had taken. He distinguished between religion as institutional doctrine, and religion as experiential encounter with mystery. The former he found often deadening, the latter he considered essential to human flourishing. His critique of Western religion centered on its image of God. The God of popular Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is essentially a cosmic monarch. He sits above creation, issuing commands and judging compliance. He is separate from the world, which exists only by his will and for his purposes. This image creates a fundamental dualism between creator and creature. It places humans in a position of permanent subordination and anxiety. No matter how loving this God is described, the basic power structure remains authoritarian. You exist at the pleasure of someone infinitely more powerful who could annihilate you at will. Watts argued that this image is anthropomorphism projected onto the infinite. We take the structure of human kingdoms and apply it to ultimate reality. Because we know kings and subjects, we imagine God and creatures. But this projection may tell us more about human political psychology than about the nature of existence. The universe may not be organized like a kingdom at all. Our political metaphors may be completely inappropriate for understanding what is. Watts proposed that the organic metaphors of Eastern philosophy are more accurate. The universe is not ruled, it grows. The mystics within Western traditions often arrived at insights incompatible with orthodox doctrine. Meister Eckhart spoke of the Godhead beyond God, a divine ground prior to any personal deity. He described the soul's ground as identical with God's ground. This was considered dangerous because it undermined the hierarchy of creator and creature. If you are already one with God, you do not need the church as intermediary. Institutional religion depends on a gap between human and divine that it claims to bridge. Mystical experience of unity threatens this institutional function directly. This explains why mystics were often persecuted by the religious establishments of their own traditions. Watts saw the Hindu concept of Brahman as more philosophically sophisticated than the Western God. Brahman is not a being among beings, but being itself. It is not a person who creates, but the creative process itself. It does not have existence. It is existence. Personal gods like Vishnu and Shiva are understood as masks or faces of Brahman. They are ways the infinite appears to finite minds, not ultimate realities themselves. This framework allows for devotional religion without ontological dualism. You can worship a personal God while understanding that God as an aspect of what you yourself are. The Buddhist approach dispenses with God language almost entirely. The Buddha remained silent on metaphysical questions about ultimate origins and destinations. He considered such speculation a distraction from the practical task of ending suffering. Buddhism focuses on the structure of experience rather than the nature of transcendent reality. This agnosticism appealed to Watts' philosophical temperament. It avoided the problems created by asserting things that cannot be known. Yet, Buddhism still addresses the same existential concerns that religions address. It offers liberation from suffering without requiring beliefs about supernatural entities. Watts was particularly interested in Zen Buddhism's approach to religious questions. Zen does not ask whether God exists, but investigates who is asking the question. It turns attention from objects of belief to the subject who believes. This radical reflexivity dissolves many traditional religious problems. The question of God's existence presupposes a questioner separate from God. But if that separation is itself illusory, the question collapses. You cannot meaningfully ask whether you are connected to ultimate reality if you are ultimate reality. Zen short-circuits theological debate by undermining its presuppositions. Watts also addressed the function of religious ritual and myth. He did not dismiss these as primitive superstition to be outgrown. Rituals are technologies for inducing particular states of consciousness and social cohesion. Myths are stories that convey truths too deep for literal statement. The problem is not myth and ritual themselves, but their literalization. When myths are taken as historical facts, they lose their transformative power. You argue about whether events really happened, rather than experiencing what they mean. Watts advocated recovering the symbolic function of religious forms without supernatural literalism. Religious experience, as distinct from religious belief, remained important to Watts. Experiences of unity, transcendence, and sacred presence occur across all cultures and traditions. William James documented their common features in his classic study over a century ago. These experiences suggest that ordinary consciousness is not the only mode available to humans. Something else is possible, something that transforms how life is lived afterward. Watts considered providing access to such experiences the genuine function of religion. Institutions that focus on belief, morality, and social control have lost this original purpose. They maintain the forms while the living content has departed. The death of God announced by Nietzsche in the 19th century was, for Watts, the death of a particular image. The cosmic monarch was becoming unbelievable to educated moderns. But this did not mean the end of religion or spirituality. It meant the opportunity to discover what was always true beneath the inadequate images. The divine does not disappear when bad portraits of it are discarded. It becomes more accessible when no longer hidden behind human projections. Watts saw his era as a potential spiritual renaissance, not a decline. The old forms were dying so that new and more adequate forms could emerge. Part 13. Science, Physics and Mysticism. Watts was fascinated by developments in modern physics and their philosophical implications. He saw convergence between cutting-edge science and ancient mystical insights. This was not wishful thinking or superficial analogy, but recognition of genuine parallels. Both modern physics and Eastern philosophy challenge the common-sense view of separate objects in empty space. Both describe a universe more like a process than a collection of things. Watts explored these parallels without claiming they proved mystical doctrines scientifically. Classical physics, from Newton through the 19th century, reinforced the fully automatic model. The universe consisted of solid particles moving through absolute space according to deterministic laws. Everything was in principle predictable if you knew the position and momentum of all particles. This picture supported a mechanistic worldview where life and mind were secondary phenomena. Reality was fundamentally dead matter in motion. The apparent purposiveness of organisms was reducible to physical causation. Consciousness was an epiphenomenon, a shadow cast by the real machinery of the brain. This picture dominated scientific thinking for over 2 centuries. 20th century physics dismantled this classical picture piece by piece. Relativity showed that space and time are not absolute, but relative to the observer. What appears simultaneous from one reference frame is sequential from another. The observer is not outside the universe looking in, but embedded in it. This undermines the Newtonian assumption of an absolute framework independent of observation. The universe does not exist the same way for all observers. Perspective is built into the structure of physical reality, not merely a subjective addition. This resonates with Eastern emphasis on the observer's participation in what is observed. Quantum mechanics went further in undermining classical assumptions. At the subatomic level, particles do not have definite properties until measured. Before measurement, they exist in superpositions of multiple possible states. The act of observation seems to collapse these possibilities into actual outcomes. This suggests that the observer plays a constitutive role in physical reality. The division between subject and object breaks down at the fundamental level. Watts saw this as scientific confirmation that separation is not ultimate. The universe is not a collection of pre-existing objects waiting to be observed. Field theory replaced particles with continuous fields as the fundamental reality. What appear as particles are actually excitations or disturbances in underlying fields. The electron is not a tiny ball, but a pattern in the electromagnetic field. Particles are processes, not things. This is remarkably similar to how Buddhists describe phenomena as events rather than substances. The noun-based ontology of common sense gives way to a verb-based ontology of happening. Watts found in field theory a scientific vocabulary for expressing non-dual insights. The field is one. Its apparent divisions are patterns within the unity. The concept of complementarity introduced by Niels Bohr also intrigued Watts. Light behaves as a wave in some experiments and as a particle in others. These descriptions are mutually exclusive, yet both necessary for a complete account. No single consistent picture captures the full reality. This echoes the non-dual insight that opposites are complementary aspects of one reality. Wave and particle are not contradictions, but polarities of a deeper unity. Bohr himself recognized this resonance and incorporated the yin-yang symbol into his coat of arms. Western physics was arriving at insights long familiar to Eastern philosophy. Watts was careful not to overstate the case for physics-mysticism convergence. Physics describes the structure of the external world using mathematics and measurement. Mysticism describes the structure of inner experience through contemplative practice. These are different domains investigated by different methods. Parallel conclusions suggest something about the nature of reality, but do not prove each other. Watts avoided the trap of using physics to legitimize mysticism or mysticism to interpret physics. He simply noted the convergence and invited reflection on what it might mean. The universe seems to have a character that both approaches reveal in different ways. Systems theory and complexity science extended these insights into biology and cognition. Living systems are not machines assembled from parts, but self-organizing wholes. They maintain their organization through continuous exchange with their environments. The boundary between organism and environment is functional, not absolute. Life is better understood as a process than as a thing. These insights aligned with what Watts had been saying for years. Science was developing languages adequate to describe the interconnected processual nature of existence. The mechanistic worldview was giving way to something more organic. The hard problem of consciousness remains unresolved by neuroscience. We can correlate brain states with conscious experiences, but cannot explain how matter produces subjectivity. Some philosophers conclude that consciousness must be fundamental, not derivative from matter. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness pervades nature, has gained renewed interest among serious thinkers. This view was central to many Eastern systems that Watts studied and taught. If they are right, consciousness is not a rare anomaly, but the basic nature of existence. Science may eventually confirm what contemplatives have long reported, or it may find some other explanation we cannot currently imagine. Part 14. Money, Work and the Social Game. Watts offered penetrating analyses of economics and work that remain relevant decades later. He viewed money and employment not as natural necessities, but as social games with arbitrary rules. Understanding their game-like character liberates you from taking them with inappropriate seriousness. This is not an excuse for irresponsibility, but an invitation to more intelligent participation. You play better when you know you are playing. Money, Watts observed, is a system of symbols that we have confused with real wealth. Real wealth consists of actual goods and services: food, shelter, transportation, education, healthcare. Money is merely a measurement and distribution system, like inches or minutes. You cannot eat money or live in it. Yet we behave as if accumulating symbols were the same as accumulating reality. We sacrifice real experiences for numerical increases in bank accounts. This is like an architect who becomes so obsessed with blueprints that he forgets to build anything. The map has replaced the territory in our collective consciousness. The confusion becomes evident when real wealth exists but cannot be distributed for lack of money. Factories sit idle while people need their products because no one has money to buy them. Workers remain unemployed while work needs doing because no one has money to pay them. We have the physical capacity to feed, house, and educate everyone. What we lack is the social agreement to issue enough symbols to enable the distribution. This is a failure of imagination, not a genuine scarcity. We are hypnotized by our own bookkeeping system. We let numbers prevent us from doing what is physically possible and humanly necessary. Watts questioned the assumption that work must be unpleasant to be valuable. We speak of earning a living as if living itself were a crime requiring expiation. The 8-hour workday assumes that productive contribution should consume the majority of waking life. Leisure is a reward for labour rather than a good in itself. This attitude treats human beings as means to economic ends rather than ends in themselves. The economy should serve human flourishing. Instead, humans serve the economy. We have inverted the proper relationship between tool and user. The tool now wields the human. Technology should have reduced the need for human labour dramatically. Machines can do in hours what once required years of human effort. Yet we have not converted this efficiency into increased leisure for all. Instead, we invented new forms of work to keep everyone busy. Much contemporary employment involves pushing papers, attending meetings, and producing reports that no one reads. These activities exist to justify employment rather than to accomplish anything real. We could provide universal basic needs with a fraction of current labour, but we lack the collective will to reimagine how we distribute resources. The Protestant work ethic, which shaped modern capitalism, carries religious assumptions Watts examined. Work is virtuous. Idleness is sinful. Prosperity indicates divine favour earned through diligent effort. Poverty suggests moral failure. These beliefs persist unconsciously even among secular people. They generate guilt about rest and compulsive busyness without purpose. People work themselves into exhaustion and illness not from necessity but from internalized religious demands. The Puritan God may be dead, but his commands still operate in the psyche. Watts advocated for what he called work as play. This does not mean that work should be trivial or unproductive. It means that the quality of attention brought to work can transform it from drudgery to engagement. The same activity can be experienced as labour or as absorption, depending on attitude. A musician practicing scales can be bored or fascinated depending on how they approach the task. External circumstances matter less than inner relationship to what one does. This insight does not excuse oppressive working conditions, but points to an additional dimension of freedom. Even within constraints, the quality of your engagement remains partly within your control. The obsession with security through accumulation reflects the ego's anxious grasping. No amount of money can make you truly secure because insecurity is built into ego consciousness. Billionaires worry about their fortunes as much as anyone worries about their modest savings. The goalpost moves as wealth increases. Enough is never enough. This is the hedonic treadmill applied to financial accumulation. Recognizing this pattern can interrupt the endless pursuit of more. At some point, continued accumulation produces diminishing returns on well-being. Beyond basic security, additional wealth adds little to life quality. Social status games intertwine with economic striving to compound the problem. We accumulate not just for security, but to signal position in the social hierarchy. Conspicuous consumption demonstrates success to others and validates the ego. This is a zero-sum game because status is relative. If everyone gets richer, no one gains status. Only relative position matters. We are trapped in a collective action problem where everyone runs to stay in place. Watts suggested that seeing through the game could reduce its compulsive hold. You can still participate while holding the game lightly. Part 15. Psychedelics and Consciousness Exploration. Watts was among the first serious Western intellectuals to explore psychedelic substances systematically. He participated in early research with LSD and mescaline during the 1950s and 60s. His book, The Joyous Cosmology, documented these experiences with literary skill and philosophical depth. He approached psychedelics not as recreation, but as tools for investigating consciousness. His perspective combined openness to their potential with caution about their risks. The psychedelic experience often produces phenomena resembling mystical states. Users report dissolution of the ordinary sense of separate selfhood. They describe experiences of unity with existence, of being everything and nothing simultaneously. Time perception changes, past, present, and future seem to coexist. Ordinary objects appear luminous with significance. The experience is typically described as more real than ordinary reality, not less. These parallels with contemplative reports fascinated Watts and many researchers of his era. They suggested that mystical states might have a neurological basis accessible through chemistry. Watts famously said that once you get the message, hang up the phone. Psychedelics could show you possibilities, but they could not substitute for integration. The insight glimpsed in a psychedelic state must be incorporated into daily life through practice. Otherwise, the experience becomes just another memory rather than a transformation. Some people took repeated trips without fundamental change in how they lived. They became connoisseurs of unusual states rather than awakened beings. Watts saw this as missing the point, using medicine as candy. The goal was liberation, not entertainment. He also warned against the inflation that psychedelic experiences could produce. Glimpsing cosmic unity does not make you spiritually superior to ordinary people. The ego can co-opt the experience and claim it as personal achievement. I had this incredible realization can become just another trophy for the self. Genuine insight dissolves the ego rather than inflating it. If you come back from a trip feeling special and enlightened, you may have missed the point. The appropriate response is humility about how much remains to be integrated and understood. Watts observed spiritual arrogance in the psychedelic community and cautioned against it. Set and setting profoundly influence the psychedelic experience. Set refers to the mental state, expectations, and intentions brought to the experience. Setting refers to the physical and social environment in which it occurs. The same substance in different contexts produces radically different experiences. A sacred ceremony guided by experienced elders differs entirely from recreational use at a party. Watts emphasized the importance of proper preparation and context. These are not drugs to be taken casually or without understanding of their power. Responsible use requires education, intention, and appropriate support. Contemporary research has revived scientific interest in psychedelics after decades of prohibition. Studies show promise for treating depression, addiction, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Brain imaging reveals how psychedelics reduce activity in the default mode network. This network, as discussed earlier, maintains the narrative sense of self. When it quiets, ego boundaries soften and new patterns of neural activity emerge. This provides a neurological account of what Watts described phenomenologically. The experience of ego dissolution corresponds to measurable changes in brain function. Science is beginning to understand what Watts explored through direct investigation. The mystical type experiences occasioned by psychedelics predict therapeutic outcomes. Patients who report profound unity experiences show better results in treating addiction and depression. The experience itself seems to be the medicine, not just the pharmacological action. This suggests that expanded states of consciousness have inherent healing potential. Watts would likely see this as confirmation of what contemplative traditions always knew. Direct experience of unity is therapeutic because separation is the root of neurotic suffering. Recognizing your connection to existence relieves the isolation that underlies many psychological problems. The insight need not be permanent to have lasting benefits. Watts did not consider psychedelics necessary for awakening. Many people throughout history achieve profound realization through meditation, prayer, or spontaneous grace. Psychedelics are one path among many, with their own advantages and dangers. For some people, at some times, they provide a useful catalyst. For others, they may be unnecessary, inappropriate, or counterproductive. There is no single right way to approach the mystery of consciousness. What matters is the result, a life lived with greater presence, compassion, and understanding. The method is instrumental, not sacred in itself. The cultural context of psychedelic use concerned Watts. Western societies lacked traditional frameworks for integrating visionary experiences. Indigenous cultures that used these substances did so within coherent ceremonial structures. Those structures provided interpretation, containment, and community support. Westerners taking psychedelics often did so without equivalent support systems. This increased the risk of difficult experiences and poor integration. Watts saw the need for new cultural forms adequate to the power of these substances. That project remains incomplete, though contemporary researchers are making progress. Part 16. Art, Play, and Purposeless Purpose. Watts considered art and play essential to understanding the nature of existence. They reveal something that instrumental activity conceals, the intrinsic value of experience itself. We pursue goals hoping they will bring satisfaction when achieved, but the satisfaction is usually brief before new goals appear. Art and play offer satisfaction in the doing itself, not in some future outcome. They model a relationship with life that could transform all activity. Play has no external purpose. It is done for its own sake. Children do not play to achieve something outside the play. The activity itself is the reward. Adults tend to forget this as they become absorbed in goal-directed work. They lose the capacity to be fully present in activity without thinking about results. Everything becomes instrumental, a means to something else. But Watts pointed out that this creates an infinite regress. If everything is a means, where is the end that justifies the means? The regress terminates only in intrinsically valuable experiences. At some point, you must do something for its own sake, or life is empty running. Play demonstrates that intrinsic value is possible right now, in any activity. It is not reserved for some future achievement or heavenly reward. The present moment, fully inhabited, is already the destination. You arrive not by getting somewhere, but by being where you are. Play models this arriving without going anywhere. It is purposeless purpose, activity without ulterior motive. Music provides Watts' favourite example of intrinsically valuable experience. When you listen to music, you do not wait impatiently for it to reach the end. If you did, the fastest songs would be the best, because they end soonest. The point of music is not to arrive at the final note, but to experience the journey. Each moment of music is complete in itself, while also part of a larger pattern. This is exactly how Watts suggested we should approach life. Life is not a journey toward a destination, but a musical process to be heard. Missing the present to reach the future is like missing the music to reach the end. Art in all forms embodies purposeless purpose. The artist creates not primarily for money, fame, or any external reward. Those may come, but they are not what drives the creative act itself. Something wants to be expressed, and the artist serves that impulse. The work is done because it must be done, because not doing it feels like suffocation. This compulsion is not suffering, but joy, the joy of participation in creation. Watts saw the universe itself as engaged in this kind of creative play. Existence is not working toward a goal, but expressing itself for the delight of expression. The distinction between work and play is largely artificial, according to Watts. The same activity can be experienced as either depending on the spirit in which it is performed. A surgeon working with intense focus and absorption is playing, in a sense. A musician performing grudgingly for money is working. The external form matters less than the internal relationship to the activity. When you do something with full presence and without mental reservation, it becomes play. When you do something while wishing you were doing something else, it becomes work. The transformation is available in any activity if you bring the right quality of attention. Children demonstrate this naturally before education trains it out of them. They approach everything with curiosity and absorption. A puddle is fascinating. A cardboard box is an infinite resource. They have not yet learned to value things according to social convention. This is not ignorance, but wisdom that adults have lost. Zen speaks of beginner's mind, seeing everything fresh without preconception. Children have this naturally. Adults must recover it deliberately. Art and play are practices for recovering the wonder that childhood knew. The aesthetic experience involves a temporary suspension of the ego's agenda. When you are absorbed in a beautiful sunset, you are not planning your next move. The strategic, calculating mind relaxes and perception opens. This is why beauty is often described as transporting you out of yourself. What actually happens is that the constructed self temporarily thins out. You become the seeing rather than a seer who is seeing. This egoless perception is what contemplatives cultivate as their normal state. Aesthetic experience gives everyone tastes of what deeper practice stabilizes. Watts worried that modern societies were becoming incapable of genuine play. Even leisure is often approached with goal orientation, self-improvement, networking, optimizing. We cannot simply be, we must always be doing something useful. This compulsion produces exhaustion without satisfaction. It treats life as a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be received. Recovery requires learning again to waste time beautifully. Not every moment must be productive. Some moments should simply be. This is not laziness, but the highest form of living. Part 17. Intellectual Influences and Historical Context. Watts drew from an unusually wide range of intellectual sources. Understanding these influences clarifies both the content and the style of his thinking. He was not a systematic philosopher constructing original theories. He was a synthesizer, finding common patterns across diverse traditions and presenting them accessibly. His genius lay in integration and communication rather than original discovery. D.T. Suzuki was the most important direct influence on Watts' engagement with Zen. Watts met Suzuki in 1936 and studied his writings intensively. Suzuki had made Zen available to Western readers through numerous books in English. His presentation emphasized the sudden, non-rational character of Zen insight. Watts absorbed this presentation and popularized it further for wider audiences. Later, scholars criticized both Suzuki and Watts for oversimplifying Zen. But their work opened doors that enabled deeper subsequent engagement by Westerners. First contact often requires simplification that later study can correct and deepen. Carl Jung's analytical psychology deeply influenced Watts' thinking about the psyche. Jung's concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and individuation provided psychological frameworks. Jung had himself been influenced by Eastern thought and saw parallels with Western mysticism. He wrote introductions to translations of Eastern texts that Watts read carefully. Watts met Jung in 1958 and found him a kindred spirit. Both were exploring the borderland where psychology meets spirituality. Watts integrated Jungian ideas into his synthesis without becoming a Jungian in any doctrinaire sense. The semantic theories of Alfred Korzybski shaped how Watts thought about language. Korzybski's general semantics emphasized the map territory distinction discussed earlier. He developed techniques for recognizing when we confuse words with reality. This work sensitized Watts to the role of language in constructing the ego illusion. Watts saw that the separate self is partly a grammatical artifact. Different languages might construct different selves. Korzybski's ideas helped Watts articulate why Eastern insights were so hard for Westerners to grasp. The very structure of our language works against them. Norbert Wiener's cybernetics provided scientific vocabulary for systemic interconnection. Cybernetics studies feedback loops, self-regulating systems, and information processing. Watts found in cybernetics a Western scientific framework compatible with Eastern holism. The individual is not separate from the environment, but connected through feedback loops. What I do affects the world. What the world does affects me. These are one circular process. Watts incorporated cybernetic concepts into the way of Zen and later works. This gave his presentations scientific credibility they might otherwise have lacked. He was not importing mysticism into science, but finding genuine convergences. The Theosophical movement and its offshoots formed part of Watts' early intellectual environment. His mother and the Buddhist lodge in London had connections to Theosophy. Theosophy was a 19th century movement attempting to synthesize Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. It popularized terms like karma and reincarnation in the West. While Watts later distanced himself from Theosophy's more speculative claims, its synthetic impulse influenced him. He inherited the project of finding common ground across traditions. His approach was more philosophically rigorous than Theosophy, but the goal was similar. The counterculture of the 1960s provided the audience for Watts' widest influence. Young people questioning conventional values found in Watts an articulate alternative voice. He gave intellectual grounding to the intuition that something was wrong with mainstream society. His critiques of ego, materialism, and alienation resonated with emerging cultural movements. He was not a political activist, but a philosophical resource for those who were. His influence on the Beat Generation and later the hippie movement was substantial. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Gary Snyder all engaged with his work. He helped shape the spiritual dimension of an era's rebellion against conformity. The Human Potential movement at places like Esalen Institute created institutional context for Watts' teaching. Esalen, founded in 1962, became a center for exploring consciousness and personal growth. Watts was a regular presenter there and influenced its development. The movement blended psychological and spiritual approaches in ways Watts advocated. Gestalt therapy, encounter groups, and various body practices all found home at Esalen. Watts fit naturally into this milieu as an articulate philosophical voice among practitioners. His influence on what became the wellness and mindfulness industries, though often unacknowledged, was formative. Contemporary meditation apps and retreat centres carry his legacy forward. Academically, Watts occupied an ambiguous position throughout his career. He had scholarly credentials and taught at legitimate institutions. But his popular success and lack of traditional academic publication made him suspect to scholars. He was too accessible to be respectable in academic eyes. Yet his accessibility was precisely what made his ideas influential outside academia. This tension between depth and accessibility is inherent in the project of philosophical communication. Watts chose accessibility and accepted the cost to his academic standing. History may judge this choice more kindly than his contemporary critics did. Part 18. Critiques, Limitations and Scholarly Debates. Any honest assessment of Watts must address the substantial criticisms levelled against him. These came from both traditional scholars of Asian religions and from fellow practitioners. Engaging with critiques strengthens understanding by revealing genuine problems and complexities. Watts himself would likely approve of this scrutiny, given his commitment to honest inquiry. The most common scholarly criticism is that Watts oversimplified the traditions he presented. Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Vedanta are complex systems developed over centuries. They contain internal debates, diverse schools, and nuances that resist easy summary. Watts collapsed this complexity into accessible narratives that obscured important differences. A traditional Zen teacher might not recognize their practice in Watts' description. This simplification served his popularizing purpose, but at a cost to accuracy. Critics argue that what Watts presented was not Zen or Taoism, but something new of his own creation. He was synthesizing more than transmitting. Philip Kapleau, an American Zen teacher who trained for years in Japanese monasteries, criticized Watts directly. Kapleau emphasized that Zen requires rigorous discipline, not just intellectual understanding. Watts sometimes implied that insight could be grasped through listening and reading alone. This, Kapleau argued, gave people the comfortable illusion of understanding without the difficult work of practice. Zen masters spend years in meditation, often in demanding physical conditions. They do not achieve realization by reading books, even excellent ones. Watts' approach could produce intellectual appreciation without genuine transformation. People might think they got it when they had only begun to glimpse the problem. Even D.T. Suzuki, who admired Watts, expressed reservations. Suzuki reportedly said Watts understood Zen, but from the outside. He could explain it brilliantly, but had not fully realized it in his own experience. This distinction between understanding about and direct knowing is crucial in contemplative traditions. A person can describe the taste of strawberries eloquently without having tasted one. The description might even be accurate and helpful to those who have not tasted. But it remains qualitatively different from the direct experience it describes. Some critics placed Watts in this category, eloquent about something he had not fully attained. Watts' personal life provided ammunition for critics questioning his realization. He struggled with alcoholism for much of his later life. He had 3 marriages and various personal difficulties. A truly enlightened being, critics suggested, would not have such problems. If Watts had seen through the ego, why did his ego continue causing trouble? This criticism assumes that enlightenment produces perfect behavior, which is itself debatable. Even in traditional contexts, teachers with genuine insight sometimes displayed human failings. The relationship between realization and character is complex and controversial. Watts himself acknowledged that he was not offering himself as an exemplary spiritual master. He called himself an entertainer and a philosophical broadcaster. He did not claim to be enlightened or to have finished his own development. This modesty might be a defense against criticism or genuine self-assessment. Either way, it complicates the critique based on his personal life. He was not asking people to follow him as a guru, but to consider ideas on their merits. Whether the messenger's life validates or invalidates the message is a separate question. Many profound truths have been articulated by flawed people. Cultural appropriation has become a contemporary critique of Watts's entire project. He was a white Westerner interpreting traditions that were not his own. He did not train extensively in any traditional Asian lineage. His presentations inevitably filtered Eastern ideas through Western assumptions. This could distort the original teachings and disrespect their cultural contexts. It could also perpetuate colonial patterns of extracting value from other cultures. This critique has force, though its implications are debated. Some argue that genuine philosophical insights transcend cultural boundaries and belong to humanity. A more philosophical critique questions whether Watts' central claims are actually true. Is the ego really an illusion? Perhaps the sense of individual selfhood accurately reflects something real about our nature. The self might be constructed as Watts claims, yet still genuinely exist as constructions do. Social constructions, like money and nations, have real effects even though they are not natural facts. Dismissing the ego as mere illusion might be too quick. Even if neuroscience shows no single brain location for the self might be a valid higher-level description. These philosophical debates continue without resolution. Despite all criticisms, Watts's positive contributions are substantial and enduring. He introduced millions of Westerners to ideas they would otherwise never have encountered. He did so with unusual clarity, wit, and intellectual integrity. Many people first glimpsed alternatives to Western materialism through his books and lectures. He opened doors. Whether people walked through them was their own responsibility. Even critics who dispute his accuracy often acknowledge his role as gateway. First exposure is not the same as mastery, but it is necessary for mastery to become possible. Watts's legacy includes all who began with him and continued deeper. Conclusion. Legacy and contemporary relevance. Alan Watts died in 1973, over 50 years ago. Yet his voice continues reaching new audiences through recordings, books, and internet distribution. Millions of people have discovered him through YouTube videos and podcast samples. His lectures circulate in forms he could never have imagined, soundtracked with ambient music for new generations. Something in what he said continues to resonate despite massive cultural changes. That something is the perennial insight that separation is illusion and connection is reality. This insight becomes more relevant as global problems reveal our interdependence. Climate change, pandemics, and economic instability cannot be solved by separate nations acting alone. They require recognition that humanity is one system affecting itself. The ego-driven exploitation of nature that Watts criticized has produced precisely the crises he predicted. We are sawing off the branch we sit on, just as he warned. His diagnosis has proven accurate. Whether his prescription will be taken remains to be seen. Neuroscience has increasingly supported the core claims Watts made about the self. The brain constructs the narrative of selfhood rather than simply reflecting a pre-existing entity. Meditation and psychedelics can alter this construction, revealing its contingency. The default mode network, discovered decades after Watts' death, provides a mechanism for what he described experientially. He arrived at conclusions through contemplation that science later confirmed through measurement. This convergence suggests he was tracking something real, not merely spinning attractive ideas. The mindfulness movement owes much to Watts, even when his name goes unmentioned. Contemporary meditation apps and secular mindfulness programs descend from traditions he helped introduce. The idea that present-moment awareness reduces suffering is now mainstream psychological advice. Doctors prescribe meditation. Corporations offer mindfulness training to employees. This represents massive cultural change from the 1950s when Watts began broadcasting. He was among those who made Eastern contemplative practices acceptable and accessible to Westerners. The full fruition of that work surrounds us today. Limitations remain even in this legacy. Mindfulness can become another self-improvement project for the ego, rather than a dissolution of ego illusion. Corporations may use meditation to make workers more productive rather than more liberated. Consumerist spirituality sells enlightenment as a product rather than revealing it as already present. Watts would likely critique these distortions while appreciating the underlying shift they reflect. Even compromised forms of wisdom can open doors to deeper engagement later. The alternatives are either purity with no influence or impurity with some. Watts chose influence and accepted the compromises that entailed. His approach to philosophy remains relevant as a model. He showed that profound ideas could be communicated without academic jargon or institutional gatekeeping. He demonstrated that accessibility and depth are not enemies, but partners. He treated his audience as intelligent adults capable of engaging serious questions. This respect for ordinary people's philosophical capacity is itself a kind of democratic faith. Wisdom is not reserved for specialists, but available to anyone willing to investigate. Watts' entire career embodied this conviction and proved its validity. The questions he raised remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable in any final sense. What is the self? What is the relationship between individual and cosmos? How should we live, given our mortality and interdependence? These questions admit no definitive solutions. They must be lived rather than solved. Each generation must engage them freshly with whatever resources it possesses. Watts provided resources that continue to serve those who discover them. His voice, preserved in recordings, still invites listeners into inquiry. The invitation is not to believe what Watts believed, but to investigate what he investigated. He repeatedly said he was not trying to convert anyone to any doctrine. He was pointing at something and suggesting people look for themselves. The pointing was skillful, often brilliant, sometimes flawed. But the thing pointed at remains whatever it is, regardless of the skill of any pointer. Those who mistake the finger for the moon have missed his message entirely. Those who look where he pointed may discover something that no words can capture. That discovery, if it comes, is their own and no one else's. This is the truth Watts spent his life articulating. You are what you are looking for. The search for meaning ends when you realize you are the meaning you sought. The anxiety of separation dissolves when you recognize you were never separate. The fear of death releases when you see that what dies is not what you ultimately are. These are not beliefs to accept, but possibilities to explore. Watts explored them with unusual energy, honesty, and communicative skill. His exploration continues through all who take it up for themselves. The conversation he started has no end, because the mystery has no bottom.